United States aircraft have resumed action in North Vietnam.
The events of 1968 tore across America with the force of a hurricane. And popular music was at the eye of every storm. For every headline, there was a song from artists like James Brown, Aretha Franklin, the Jefferson Airplane, and the Beatles.
We definitely wanted to write about things that meant something to somebody and that could possibly help them in this completely mad, chaotic world that America was at that time.
Young American soldiers were fighting in a civil war halfway around the world in a country called Vietnam and paying a heavy price. Nearly 10,000 U.S. troops had died there in 1967, and in '68 things would only get worse.
We gotta get out of this place. If it's the last thing we ever do.
The number one anthem of all the troops when I was there was Eric Burdon and the Animals, We Gotta Get Out of This Place. Anytime that we were in the rear and that song was played or came on, everyone would stop. Everyone would join in at the top of their lungs. It was just the best song.
By January 1968, Vietnam's Civil War had become America's civil crisis.
But you sure can't hide.
By law, every man between the ages of 18 and 25 was required to register for the draft, but the poor were always the first to go.
It was very much as though the sergeant had come up to the front of the group and said, everybody whose dad made more than $20,000 a year and who's been to college, get over here, you're out. You know, everybody whose dad made less than $20,000 a year who didn't go to college, over here, you're in.
I mean, it was like a series of events that would all come true in my mind. I'll be drafted, I'll most certainly go in the Army, I'll most certainly be sent to Vietnam, and I will most certainly be killed.
John Fogerty was drafted in 1966. He didn't go to Vietnam, but he did serve 2 years in the Army. There, he says he witnessed the inequality of the draft firsthand. In '68, Fogerty was fronting a band called Creedence Clearwater Revival, writing songs which would later become anti-war anthems.
One day I got in my mind the idea of fortunate son, sort of a twist or a flip on the phrase favorite son. I don't know how I went from one to the other, but once I thought in terms of a fortunate son, I mean, all my venom came out.
Until early 1968, political and military leaders insisted that the war was going well. But more and more Americans were having their doubts.
They would tell you we lost 12 guys. And they would tell you the other side lost 2,000 guys. Pretty soon it seemed like, well, the other guys have lost 10 million guys and we've lost 30. Yet you're seeing these newsreels of devastation. And our army is being pushed back and not doing very well.
Then on January 30th, 1968, North Vietnamese and communist-backed guerrilla forces in South Vietnam launched the Tet Offensive.
The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong attack every single American military installation simultaneously in Vietnam and penetrate the perimeter of the American embassy in Saigon, and basically all hell breaks loose. And this causes an almost overnight revolution in the way America thinks about this war.
Breakfast where the news is read.
The Tet Offensive finally convinced most Americans that the war was unwinnable. And music became more and more a part of the anti-war movement as a result, I think.
It's all over for the unknown soldier.
The strange, delirious undertones of new music by bands like The Doors, Jimi Hendrix, and the Jefferson Airplane resonated in the jungles of Vietnam and swept across college campuses where students were exploring the links between mind-altering drugs and spiritual paths of knowledge.
One pill makes you larger, and one pill
still makes you small.
Psychedelia acid provided a certain outlaw capacity to the people who took it, but more importantly, it gave them a view of life that they hadn't had before.
To the counterculture, the Vietnam War wasn't just dangerous, it was absurd. And a military veteran and protest singer named Country Joe McDonald wrote a song that seemed to capture that dark vision.
1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. Next stop is Vietnam.
Well, to be perfectly blunt, the message of the song is F you. F you, Mr. President. F you, Department of Defense. F you, Commander-in-Chiefs. F all you people. You want me to go out and die for something and you won't even explain it to me. You won't tell me what to do, just F off.
The tune is called the I Feel Like I'm Fixin' to Die rag, and in '68 you'd hear it everywhere.
Music like Country Joe's helped us to stay sane.
Philip Butler was a fighter pilot who was shot down over North Vietnam. By 1968, he'd been a prisoner of war for 3 years and would endure 5 more before he was released. He was shackled with his fellow POWs at an infamous prison called the Hanoi Hilton. It was there he first heard the Fixin' to Die rag on a Viet Cong radio program of anti-war propaganda.
It's a very compelling tune and has great rhythm, and it has a nice black GI humor to it. Whoopee, we're all gonna die is pretty funny when you're sitting there in a situation like that. It rings very true for you.
After the Tet Offensive, the anti-war movement gathered momentum. 2 senators, Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy, signed on and openly challenged President Lyndon Johnson for the 1968 Democratic nomination.
Good evening, my fellow Americans.
Then on March 31st, in a televised speech watched by 70 million people, Lyndon Johnson announced that he was withdrawing from the race.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Mass anti-war protests had helped bring about the demise of a once popular president, and music had fueled the crusade.
Sitting in the morning sun.
For a few precious hours, the peace movement savored their victory. No one imagined the firestorm about to break.
Look like nothing's gonna change. Everything still remains the same. I can't do what 10 people tell me to do, so I guess I'll remain the same.
During the mid-60s, the civil rights movement had become a powerful instrument for social change. And by '68, songs like Curtis Mayfield's We're a Winner were being played on radio stations across the country.
I don't mind living here to show the world we have no fear, 'cause we're a winner.
Black folks needed to hear that, and it helped, I suppose, in its own way with the struggle. And it wasn't even so much the depth of lyric, but we're moving on up. Lord have mercy, we're moving up.
All the world over so easy to see. People everywhere just wanna be free.
In '68, it seemed music was building a bridge across the racial divide.
What was so exciting about 1968 was that you really felt like, because there were these black and white artists playing together and who we all worshiped together, you felt for this tiny moment that there was the possibility of genuine racial and sexual equality in America, which was something which we achieved on the radio but never really achieved for any lasting moment anywhere else.
Let us be willing to turn the other cheek with the realization that it is better to go through life with a scarred up body than with a scarred up soul.
As the war in Vietnam dragged on, Martin Luther King exerted his influence on behalf of the peace movement. More than any other national figure, he exuded a spiritual authority which transcended politics, generations, and race.
People get ready, there's a train a-coming.
It's easy to forget that a lot of what 1968 was about was being anti-materialistic. Martin Luther King said it's time for us to move from being a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society.
In a country that seemed to be splitting at the seams, King was that rare figure who was still struggling to keep it together.
So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Then on April 4th, 1968, while standing on a motel balcony in Memphis, Martin Luther King was shot by a white man named James Earl Ray.
At 7:10 this evening, Martin Luther King was shot in Tennessee. Martin Luther King, 20 minutes ago, died.
As news of the assassination spread, expressions of anguish and sorrow gave way to a violent fury.
After Martin Luther King is assassinated, you have the worst riots in modern American history. You have machine gun nests on the steps of the Capitol. You have federal troops guarding the lawn of the White House.
Within 48 hours of King's death, 130 cities across America were scarred by looting and arson. But in Boston, city leaders turned to the godfather of soul to quell an incipient riot. In a televised concert from the Boston Garden, James Brown pleaded for peace.
Wait a minute, wait! This is no way! We are black! We are black! Now wait a minute! Now I asked the police to step back because I figured I could get some respect from my own people. That makes sense. And all we together win.
Fans stayed home and tuned in that night, and the streets stayed quiet. James Brown had convinced the rioters to stop. Then Aretha Franklin admonished everyone to think. Deeply disturbed by Dr. King's death and the destruction which followed, Aretha wrote a song to bring a community back together.
Think about what you're trying to do to me. Think, let your mind go, let yourself be free. Oh, freedom, freedom, freedom.
You have to stand up and be counted for things that you believe in and what you feel is right. And that's what I did. Mm-hmm.
Public confrontations were becoming the order of the day. On April 26th, 200,000 high school and college students across the U.S. boycotted class to protest the Vietnam War.
These were the children of the most privileged classes in America, and they were revolting against the system, and this was much more terrifying in a way to white middle-class America to see people just like themselves fighting with the police.
Beyond America, passion and protest raged in the streets of Paris, London, Mexico City, and Prague. Young people everywhere were challenging authority and the status quo. Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones captured that heady spirit of rebellion in Street Fighting Man.
That line in Street Fighting Man, everywhere I hear the sound of marching, charging feet, that was going on all around the world. Jagger went to a lot of street rallies in England at the time. There was a March 1968 rally at the American Embassy. English kids outraged at the pervasiveness of U.S. foreign policy in the world, and the quagmire that was Vietnam, and this kind of a thing. And Jagger was at that rally.
With Martin Luther King gone, Robert Kennedy's bid for president acquired a more emotional, even desperate aura. For many, Kennedy was the country's last hope.
He appealed to lower-class white people as well as blacks, as well as middle-class whites. He really had the capacity to build a kind of coalition.
Late in the evening of June 4th at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, supporters were celebrating Robert Kennedy's victory in the crucial California presidential primary.
My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there.
But moments after he finished speaking, Kennedy was shot in the head from point-blank range by a man named Sirhan Sirhan.
If there's a doctor in the house, I want to see him right here. Everybody else, please stay back. Please stay back.
Hours later, he was dead.
Is there a doctor in the house?
brother need not be idealized or enlarged in death beyond what he was in life. To be remembered simply as a good and decent man who saw wrong and tried to right it, saw suffering and tried to heal it, saw war and tried to stop it. Those of us who loved him and who take him to his rest today pray that what he was to us and what he wished for others will someday come to pass for all the world.
After his funeral in New York, Robert Kennedy's body was carried by train to Washington, where he would be laid to rest near the grave of his slain brother, John. Tens of thousands of admirers lined the tracks to say goodbye. Now, with both Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King gone, it seemed there was no one left to pick up the torch.
Didn't you love the things that they stood for? Didn't they try to find some good for you and me? A lot of people, but it seemed good they die young. You know, I just looked around and he's gone.
It was only June, but 1968 was already one of the most tumultuous years in U.S. history. The murders of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy unleashed shockwaves of grief and fury. But by summer, another kind of wave was rolling across the American heartland. A tribal movement bound together by sex, drugs, and rock and roll. They were called hippies, and bands like the Jefferson Airplane, the Grateful Dead, and Big Brother and the Holding Company were their musical messengers.
What was significant about the year 1968 was that the entire counterculture became known to people across the country. It started around 64 or 65 in San Francisco, and it slowly just reached out like this pool of water racing across the nation.
If you're going to San Francisco, be sure to wear some flowers in your hair.
We went to, I think, Grinnell College in Iowa once in maybe '67. And all the people came to the show in like prom gowns and tuxedos. And then we came back to Grinnell the next year, and they were having like nude love-ins and mud bath parties and acid freakouts and all this sort of thing in just 1 year.
My green tambourine.
In Vietnam, young American soldiers were fighting for their lives. In America, their friends were having the time of their lives. The contrast was staggering.
At the time, I was a 28-year-old rock and roll star. So I was selfish and concerned with who I could get into bed, how the record was doing, where we were going on the road, isn't this fun, and how many drugs I could take. So there's a lot of selfish hedonism going on. At the same time, on a different level, you do care about how the country's going and about how the world's going, but I'd have to say there's an awful lot of what's in it for me.
In reality, it was politics, not rock and roll, that gave the revolution its substance. But music did give it style. The regal elegance of Aretha Franklin, the icy authority of Grace Slick, and the wrenching blues of Janis Joplin were redefining the role of women. 1968 marked the beginning of a feminist revolution, and not just in music.
Grace Slick and Janis Joplin and Aretha Franklin are really contributing to the feminist movement indirectly because they are just as famous and just as important as any male rock and roll star. So you see real artistic equality between men and women as well as between blacks and whites.
Grace Slick and Aretha Franklin sang songs that demanded liberation and respect. Janis went one step further. She lived it.
Tell me, come on! Tell me why! What's the why? people tell me what love, honey, what love is love.
Janis, just by standing there on stage and singing those songs, you know, and then doing that kind of thing and getting sweaty and dirty and ugly and putting it all out front and that distortion in her voice, she was making a political statement.
If the women were on the verge of just kind of trying to move right up there to the fence and see what was going on, then Janis was big enough, formidable enough to say, it can be done, it's okay, come on over, you know. So I think that she helped in that sense.
Rock and roll outlaws like Grace and Janis were determined to take charge of their own destinies.
Some guy at one concert in Chicago said he thought he was being clever, and he said, "Hey, Gracie, take off your chastity belt." And I said, "Chastity belt? Hell, I don't even wear underpants. I pulled up my skirt." And the band goes, "Ah." But 60s, we just took all the stuff off.
Music, music. From Saigon, this is the American Forces Vietnam Network, where the hits just keep on coming.
Oh, I could hide.
In Vietnam, soldiers were staging a musical rebellion of their own. The Armed Forces Radio Network was tightly controlled, so troops created their own bandit radio stations.
This is a dedication to the United States Army. Army sucks.
Even on the front line, soldiers could send out requests for songs the Army didn't approve of.
I just spun the dials. Lo and behold, here's Midnight Jack broadcasting. Midnight Jack, I'm deep in the jungle. Oh, bad news, Mooney Rand. He says, what can I play for you, man? How about some Jimi Hendrix? He's gone for about 30 seconds. I imagine he's putting a reel-to-reel tape on, you know, and here comes Jimi Hendrix.
There must be some kind of way out of here. Say the joker to the thief.
In the summer of '68, fighting in Vietnam was intensifying. Back home in America's heartland, the stage was set for another battle. It was August, and Democrats were gathering in a convention hall in Chicago to nominate their presidential candidate. In a park nearby, the anti-war movement was planning a convention of their own.
I can't understand why you feel you are doing your country good by going and fighting in Vietnam.
Some of the biggest names in rock were invited to entertain the thousands of protesters converging on the Windy City. Chicago Mayor Richard Daley was not amused. He refused to grant marching or camping permits to the demonstrators.
The whole thing, I thought, was fraught with confrontation and danger, and I think we saw that. So we didn't go to Chicago, no.
In that climate of fear, only one band, the politically radical MC5, showed up.
When we got to Chicago, none of the other bands showed up. They all seemed to have got distracted. I think in all fairness, they were afraid of the Chicago Police Department. They were afraid of what was going to happen.
The MC5 played in Chicago's Lincoln Park the afternoon before the Democratic Convention began. But the Chicago Police Department, the FBI, and the U.S. Army had all sent agents to disrupt the festival.
It got to be time to perform. It was very creepy because it wasn't like a rock concert. Guys in Army fatigue jackets with short hair and they were going around starting fights with people and pushing people around, and the Chicago Police Department were riding their motorcycles. They were riding them through the middle of the crowd, you know, knocking people over.
The Democratic Convention began the next day on a high note. Aretha Franklin thrilled the hall by singing the national anthem. But that moment of harmony would be short-lived. Across the Atlantic in Eastern Europe, Soviet tanks were rolling into Czechoslovakia, crushing the fragile freedom of the Prague Spring. It also turned out to be a preview of what was about to go down on the streets of Chicago. On the third night of the Democratic Convention, August 28th, all the tensions and conflicts which had been simmering in America that summer boiled over. When anti-war protesters tried to march to the convention hall, Chicago's police launched a riot of their own.
Night of the nomination of the Democratic Party, was just a free-for-all on worldwide television with young people and others just being bloody senseless.
These police officers were lashing out in their own blind rage. The traditional answer is, if you disagree with me, then I'll beat your ass. And that's the solution they were using. Of course, the issues at play here were way bigger than the policemen and the protesters.
The actual fighting that happened in Chicago in 1968 was class warfare, but not of the kind that we thought that we were conducting. We thought we were upholding the impoverished and the downtrodden in America. In fact, the impoverished and the downtrodden had gotten jobs at the police department and were busting us over the head.
Not only hippies were getting beat up, but reporters like Dan Rather and Mike Wallace were getting beat up by daily security people on the floor of the Chicago Convention.
If it wasn't for bad luck, I wouldn't have no luck at all.
In one wild night, a generation's romantic dreams of sweeping aside the old order came crashing down in a hard rain of terror and tear gas.
There was a sense that the brutality in Vietnam was coming home, and that what we were seeing in the streets of Saigon, we were now seeing in the streets of the city of Chicago.
I've been down since I began to crawl.
America's mood was turning darker, and so would the music. A summer's worth of hippie dreams had curdled into a nightmare of violence at the Democratic Convention in Chicago. Now came a season of growing discontent, with pop hits that reflected a souring climate of anxiety and mistrust.
Martin Luther King was shot. Bobby Kennedy was shot. It's a hard time to have faith in the dream or hope in the dream because they keep picking off the leaders.
The music just got darker across the board.
Now the time has come. No place to run.
Time Has Come Today by the Chambers Brothers. You know, it sounded like it was, you know, your last chance to make a decision in terms of where you stood, you know. Time has come today, you know, young hearts must go their way. You can't put it off another day. You know, you had to decide.
I'm a political man.
The presidential campaign turned bitter and joyless, and Republican candidate Richard Nixon took dead aim at the counterculture by promising a return of old-fashioned values of law and order.
I'm sure that many who have great causes, the cause of peace, the cause of civil rights, the cause of participating in the management of their universities or their colleges may say, if the cause is great enough, break the law. But my friends, once you say that each man makes his own law, some man, someplace in this country will make his own twisted law, and we will all suffer as a result. That is why it is time for us to restore respect for law, and then we'll have real progress in the United States of America.
Meanwhile, the number of American soldiers in Vietnam had reached an all-time high, over 540,000. The war had become a cancer on the body politic.
When we started protesting it, we thought we'd have it over in a year. And not only was it not over, it was getting bigger.
Throughout 1968, David Crosby was writing songs for his new band, a trio called Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Their sound was gentle and consoling, but ballads like Long Time Gone reflected deep feelings of loss and sorrow.
And it appears to be long, appears to be long.
Long Time Gone actually came about the day after they shot the second Kennedy. That really discouraged an awful lot of young people in this country at that time from being willing to participate.
It's a long, 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 long time before the dawn.
The civil rights movement was also mired in despair, but in October '68, James Brown produced an irresistible pop anthem titled Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. The music and the message struck a universal chord.
When James came up with Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, people sort of began to accept their blackness.
Some people say
a little more, saying, well, James says it, and, you know, that's fine. That's fine with me.
Brother, we can't quit until we get our share.
It came out of the dashboard of a car and it put a new part in your hair. It was unbelievable. But it was real as steel, and you knew he felt it. You know, that's why it was an anthem.
James Brown still believed in the American dream, but others had their doubts.
Since we cannot get along with white America in peace and equality, after giving America 400 years of our sweat and our blood, and receiving in return some of the worst treatment that any human beings have ever experienced, we believe that our contributions to this land and the suffering forced upon us by white America justifies our demand for a complete separation in a state or a territory of our own.
In former hippie enclaves like Haight-Ashbury and New York's East Village, the party was all but over. Even among pop stars, psychedelic daydreams were giving way to darker addictions.
You know I smoked a lot of grass. Oh Lord, I popped a lot of pills.
You know, you weren't supposed to drink. That alcohol was the drug of the old generation, and pot and psychedelics were the, you know, the new drugs of the new consciousness, the new awakening. But at the end of 1968, there were plenty of people drinking. There were plenty of hippies drinking, and plenty of rock musicians drinking and starting to use cocaine and starting to use heroin a lot more.
You know I've seen a lot of people walking around with tombstones in their eyes.
You felt like just in the whole society at large, there was a turn for the worse there for a while. This initial inspirational phase was over with, and then everything took a dive.
On Election Day, November 5th, 1968, polls showed the two leading presidential candidates in a dead heat. But when all the results were in, Richard Nixon had been elected President of the United States.
I bet you wondered how I knew I chose things to make me blue.
In his victory speech, Nixon promised to bring the country back together. But after all that had happened in 1968, his triumph was a bitter pill for some to swallow.
I could not help but be pissed off. That was the whole My America, right or wrong gang saying, Dick Nixon, he'll fix it for us. Dick Nixon couldn't fix a Kleenex box. And what they were saying was, we're not backing out of this war.
Nixon getting elected in 1968 was just exactly what you would expect out of an evil beast like America. It just confirmed our opinion that the country was insane and terrible and so on and so forth. If somebody like Robert Kennedy or Gene McCarthy had been elected and then had to make all the compromises that Nixon had to make, of course, then we might have learned something. We might have realized just how complicated power in the democracy is.
Just weeks after Nixon's victory, the Beatles released a two-record set known as the White Album, filled with music as wide-ranging and undefinable as the year itself. It included a song called Revolution, but instead of a call to arms, John Lennon sang of putting politics aside to work on more personal issues. The song incited a firestorm of controversy.
When we talk about destruction, don't you know that you can count me out?
The White Album generated a lot of talk, a lot of discussion. To have a song like Revolution on the record where John Lennon, who had always been very political in one form or another, he was kind of talking back to the radical movements of the time and saying, you know, we need to look at ourselves, we need to look deeper and make sense out of all these clashing emotions and images and things.
You better free your mind and stay.
It's a lot easier to say, oh, all of us together, like a bunch of battering rams. But it's more up to me to change. And, God, I don't want to change me. I just want to stay the same. It's a lot easier.
The revolution of '68 may have been coming to an end, but Revolution the song held the seeds of a prophecy. Next.
I'm so
whole time. My mind is on the bling.
The social and political earthquakes of 1968 produced plenty of aftershocks. Demonstrations against the war in Vietnam grew larger. The protests often turned violent and sometimes deadly.
I don't know what to do.
But there would never be another year quite like 1968.
You really have to remember that 1968 is the only year since the Depression when people really felt as if America could fall apart.
I think there was a real revolution. I think there was a real violent revolution.
But after all the smoke from that revolution had cleared, it was hard to know who won and who lost. The Vietnam War lasted 7 more years. And to this day, Dr. Martin Luther King's visions of justice and racial harmony have yet to be fulfilled. But back in '68, many songwriters and their fans believed that music would change the world.
In a white room with black curtains near the station.
I think the world was changed in a very small way by music, and I think that we have helped people be less alone. We have helped them feel less crazy.
But now, 3 decades later, even some of '68's most outspoken advocates for change see that year's events in a different light.
It was a movement that we naively thought would change the cultural face of the world. I mean, I did. I was dumb enough to think if you take psychedelics and if you read enough books, that intellectually you can change the dynamic of human aggression.
There was a lot of stupidity and a lot of naivete in the 60s, no question about it.
Others have grown cynical and reject the notion that music ever mattered.
Strobe lights beam, create streams.
The main thing about 60s music, where it reflected our attitude, was its self-importance. And by 1968 or 1969, it thought it was a method of achieving spiritual truth and political justice around the world. Oh no, this is vaudeville. This is vaudeville. Jugglers don't save the world. Fire eaters don't save the world. People who make parakeets disappear in a handkerchief don't save the world. Why would guitar players save the world?
But if the music of 1968 had only a glancing impact on the dramatic events of the day, its legacy still lingers in the hearts and minds of a generation.
We did make a dream come true for ourselves. And the dream was not about money, and it was not about style. It was about your heart and the way you live and society and the way we all live together.
People keep saying, hey, but it was so much fun, you know, but then if you go down to the VFW at a certain time of night, they'll tell you how much fun World War II was, too. You know, you gotta be careful about that.
We have liftoff.
In late December 1968, 3 American astronauts were launched into space aboard Apollo 8.
Apollo 8, Houston, you are go for staging, over.
Then on Christmas Eve, the crew of Apollo 8 turned their camera toward the Earth.
How high can you fly?
500 million people tuned in to see our world like we had never seen it before.
The vast loneliness up here, it makes you realize just what you have back there on Earth.
And for a few fleeting moments, a nation battered by division stood united.